Did you know that between 1895 and 1937, 93 men were executed behind the walls of Folsom Prison? But their stories, they weren't lost to time. They just needed a voice. Welcome to Falling Through the Trap, where we dive into the deep, often unsettling waters of historical true crime, as well as our criminal justice system, both past and present. I'm April Moore, author and criminal justice professional, and I invite you on a journey through the human stories buried in prison records, newspaper headlines, courtroom transcripts, and so much more. I'm not just recounting cases. I'm probing into justice's paradoxes and presenting humanity found in a place we're told there isn't any: prison. Through the stories of these 93 men, we'll look at history, ethics, and certainly the death penalty, and whether or not it should have a place in America's present and future. Hello there, welcome back. Today, I'm bringing you the story of John Barthelman, Folsom's 10th execution, May 12, 1898. John Frederick Barthelman had immigrated to Rochester, New York from Germany with his parents and siblings in 1886 when he was about 20 years old. The following year, he borrowed money from his brother Valentine to open a saloon at 146 Lyell Avenue in Rochester, which he did, but evidently the work didn't suit him and he just up and left without any explanation, nor paying his brother back. Eventually, he ended up in San Diego, then Los Angeles, where he was a salesman for the Singer Sewing Machine Company. On New Year's Eve, 1891, 26-year-old John married 21-year-old Mabel Holden, a dressmaker. She was originally from Massachusetts, and they married at her parents' home in the Westlake neighborhood of Los Angeles on Emerald Street, near Toluca Street. At the time, a quite hilly and undeveloped area aside from a few homesteads. It had a lot of dense groves of eucalyptus trees and wild mustard. The house was roughly located where today you'll find the Emerald Terrace apartments. In 1893, the couple had a daughter they named Dorothea, or Doretha, which might be why she was referenced as Retha at one point. Things were not great, however. They seldom are when one of the two has an ungovernable temper, and it wasn't Mabel. She moved out of their place at 707 South Broadway in early February of 1896, and she and Dorothea moved in with her parents, Howard and Anna Holden. John responded by gathering family photos and gouging Mabel's eyes out of them. At this time, while still selling Singer sewing machines, he had also been a sales agent since September for Radham's Microbe Killer, one of those early-day cure-all miracle elixirs. This one was developed by William Radham and was hugely popular until about the 19-teens, when it was deemed false, exaggerated, and misleading. I'll throw a link in the show notes if you want to read about it. Since the previous fall, Mabel had been a clerk and seamstress at J.T. Sheward's dry goods store on the corner of Spring and First. A little over a month later, on March 24th, John received his U.S. citizenship. And in early October, Judge B.N. Smith, the same judge in the John Craig case, Episode 4, he granted Mabel a divorce on grounds of cruelty. But it was also by default because John didn't bother to show up for the proceedings. It came out during trial that while she was pregnant, he kicked her and even pushed her into a river in Woodland, California during a trip. As Dorothea grew, he would urge the toddler to kick and torment Mabel, anything to humiliate her. He also constantly verbally abused her and was known to curse at her, which at the time, just saying "damn fool" in front of a woman, let alone directed at her, was considered quite egregious. John was awarded a one-day-a-week visitation with Dorothea. On November 3rd, 1896, it was an election day, and around 5 p.m., Mabel was at work when she received a note by messenger from John. It read, "I would like to have a talk with you. Can you meet me this evening right after 6 o'clock? If you can, tell on the back of the sheet where I can see you. I don't want to go up to the house." He had good reason not to want to go up there. No one liked him. Mabel turned the note over and wrote, "Meet me," but stopped, deciding not to respond, and sent the messenger on his way. She was working on the second floor of the store, and her friend and co-worker, Angie Lord, was standing just below her. Mabel got her attention and dropped the note to her, knowing that if something terrible were to happen to her, the note would prove useful. After Angie read it, she gave Mabel a silent nod and tucked the note in her pocket. The 26-year-old divorcee figured her ex-husband wanted to talk about their daughter. He had taken to hounding Mabel and her parents about seeing the child more often, but he would also take the opportunity to torment her by just saying cruel things. He often hinted, just shy of threatening, that Mabel may come to a bad end. But Mabel stood her ground, which would be used against her later. If it had really been about the child, John would have shown up in court when he had the chance. Around 6 p.m. that night, the women left work, but Angie went to a grocery store on Main Street and would meet Mabel at the corner of 2nd and Spring afterwards. When Angie got there, she saw Mabel and John talking. She watched from a short distance as the pair spoke, and it didn't appear to be a heated discussion. Mabel returned to Angie, and together they rode the electric streetcar to 2nd and Kern Streets. I saw a reference that Angie lived with Mabel and her parents for a short time, but at the preliminary hearing on November 9th, she said she lived in the Vernon area of Los Angeles, a good ways away, so it appears she was just planning on staying at Mabel's house. They got off at 2nd and Kern, where they'd begin the short, uphill walk on a windy path toward the house that sat in a gully surrounded by a dense grove of eucalyptus trees. Unbeknownst to them, John Barthelman had boarded the same streetcar. Howard Holden kissed his granddaughter on the head, left the toddler with her grandmother, and stepped outside. He always met Mabel at the streetcar and walked with her up the path so she wouldn't have to walk alone in the dark through tall bushes of wild mustard. But that night he was running late because he had to pick up Dorothea from the neighbor's house where she was playing. Down by the street, John confronted Mabel and demanded to see Dorothea, but Mabel refused to allow him any more visitation. He said he could prove her unworthy of caring for the child, to which she dared him to produce any such evidence, declaring she'd face any accuser he brought forth. "When you can prove what you say against me," she said, "you can have her, but not until then." Despite John's persistence, Angie noticed how he appeared cooler and calmer than usual, which to her was reason enough to be concerned. John started up the narrow path toward the house, and with no other choice, the women followed single file. Near the top of the hill, their dark figures were visible to neighbors who were drawn by their animated voices. John stopped and turned around. He asked 3 more times to see Dorothea, each time receiving a no from Mabel. "No?" he mirrored sarcastically. The first 2 gunshots caused Howard to stop in his tracks. Being an election night, he first wondered if the shots had something to do with that. But Angie had seen it all. She had watched John swiftly pull a gun from his pocket and, without hesitating, shot Mabel in the head. She screamed and fell to the ground seconds before Angie, herself hollering, fled to a nearby neighbor's home to get help. Howard heard the screaming, and no doubt a painful realization crept into his heart. He ran down the path. And then the sound of 2 more shots sent jolts of agonizing terror through his body, as if he himself had taken the .32 caliber bullets. From their windows, 2 neighbors watched a woman fall at the feet of the male figure and thrust her hand up, a useless shield, against those last 2 bullets, the gunpowder flashes bright against the early evening darkness. John took off, disappearing into the night, but was seen by an unsuspecting police captain who watched a man just hurrying along the street, unaware of what had just happened. When Howard reached Mabel, he saw blood streaming from her head, arm, chest, and waist. It had to have been absolutely awful for him to see his daughter like that, and he undoubtedly thought that of all the nights to be running late to meet her. But had he been there, John would, in all likelihood, have shot him too. A neighbor, J.B. Painter, arrived at the scene, and he helped Howard carry his unconscious daughter to the house, both unsure of the extent of her injuries, until Dr. Rebecca Lee Dorsey, the first doctor to arrive, explained that a bullet had passed through Mabel's forehead just above her left eye and was lodged in the base of her brain. Another went through her forearm before entering her left lung. Mabel's labored breathing finally ceased 4 hours later, at around 11 that night. Dr. Rebecca Lee Dorsey was an American physician and endocrinologist, known as the world's first female endocrinologist and first female physician to practice in Los Angeles. She even studied under Louis Pasteur, Robert Koch, and Joseph Lister. What's more is that she also specialized in obstetrics and pediatrics, taking part in over 4,000 births during her lifetime, including that of Earl Warren, as in Supreme Court Chief Justice, the Warren Court of the 1960s, and quite possibly the last truly justice-driven SCOTUS we've had. Anyway, Dorsey had been conducting her own practice for 10 years when she arrived at the Holden house. Once police knew who to look for, they began by going to the rooming house on Downey Avenue where John now lived, but he wasn't there and hadn't been all day. They did discover that he had stopped at a Main Street cigar stand just before 8 p.m. after the shooting, and the owner, whom he knew well, said that John told him he was going to head up to Sacramento for a bit. Nothing in his behavior indicated that he had just shot his ex-wife, but John didn't go to the train depot. He went to a friend's home. Her name was Pearl Venom. She lived at 826 Buena Vista Street. Remember that street from episode 4 about John Craig? After murdering his wife, he went to the home of his in-laws, Mary and William Hunter, at 727 Buena Vista Street, and killed them. Well, a little over 2 years later, and a block away, John Barthelman was garnering the sympathy of Pearl, who listened to her friend's tale of woe. She just listened as he told her a long story of how he had heard from a friend that Mabel was guilty of infidelity, and he was bound and determined to get his daughter away from her. "Did you shoot Mabel?" asked Pearl. "I don't know," John replied. "I shot, and I can't tell what happened." Pearl didn't call police. She would later say it was because her husband wasn't home, and he wasn't, but when he did arrive home and John was still there, no one called police. Even when John left shortly thereafter, the Venoms didn't tell anyone what happened. Pearl had a bit of a soft spot for John and had been a sympathetic ear for him in the several months since the separation and subsequent divorce. So it wasn't a surprise that John returned the following morning to their house around 9 a.m., John was looking pretty rough and didn't speak much, but he did give Mr. John Venom a fully loaded pistol. Venom took him in, sat him down in a chair. Then John took out a small bottle of laudanum, a tincture of alcohol and opium, the very popular early-day opiate used then to treat all sorts of ailments. And he set it aside. It was implied that John was planning on suicide by overdose, to which the Los Angeles Herald later said he lacked the moral courage to end his own miserable existence. Police were then finally notified and John was arrested. He continued to say very little and just wrapped himself in a blanket in his cell and ignored reporters and officers. What police did know was what he told Pearl, that he had no intention of killing Mabel, and that the only reason he had the gun was because it was an election day, and he was expected to be out late to hear results, so he'd need protection on his way home. He talked about how after the divorce was granted, he had an uncontrollable impulse to kill Mabel, and even more so when he said he saw her walking in the company of another man. He claimed to have loved her dearly, but was consumed with jealousy. And when he spoke with Mabel on the streetcar and along the path, her refusal to let him see their daughter caused that old mad impulse to kill to overcome him, and he shot her. The thing I noticed about this story is the victim blaming that occurred. While this is still true today, it was especially true during those days. And when a man killed a woman, it was often because she provoked him. How dare she, right? That she stepped out of place, making her an ungrateful, stupid woman who shouldered some responsibility for her demise. We'll see that with this case. It certainly played a part in Mrs. Venom's mind and in other women's minds, who, if you ask me, were simply conditioned by society into believing this. But also, John Barthelman was extremely charming, and he seemed to have an effect on women. After leaving the Venom house the previous night, John apparently just wandered the streets and bought the laudanum with the intent to end his life, but decided to use it instead to calm his nerves. Mrs. Lily Barnes, a neighbor who witnessed the shooting, was brought to the jail to identify John as the killer. When he saw her, he pointed to his cellmate. "That's Barthelman," he said. "That's the man who did the shooting." She pointed her finger at him. "I know better. I know you, John Barthelman. Aren't you ashamed of what you did?" "No, I'm not," he replied. "If I had to do it over, I'd make a better job of it." The inquest was held the following evening, and he was found guilty and held over for a preliminary hearing that took place a week later. He appeared in court with 2 attorneys, and the brutal wretch, as he was called by the LA Times, looked nervous and tugged at his mustache a lot. All of the evidence was gone over, but the defense didn't offer any, although it was rumored he'd set up a temporary insanity plea, which at the time was a bit of a novel defense. Trial began January 18th, 1897, presided over by the same judge from earlier, B.N. Smith. The prosecution was conducted by Deputy District Attorney C.C. McComas and assisted by Lecomte Davis and Judd Rush, who represented Mabel during her divorce proceedings. Barthelman retained Frank F. Davis. John was described as, quote, looking quite debonair, his rosy and round face the picture of health. No one would have selected him in a crowd as a wife murderer or a maniac. It was implied often that he would have been a real catch had he not been a killer. It was a little tough to secure a jury. Because of the election results, a lot of people had read about the case in the papers. In fact, the case attracted a lot of attention from the public, and the courthouse was packed. Many were women, friends of Mabel's, but a lot of people also just wanted to see how a handsome husband and father could possibly be a killer. He appeared very stoic and emotionless, rarely even speaking to his attorney during the trial. Once a jury was secured, testimony began. J.B. Painter, the neighbor, heard 3 shots and ran to a window where he saw a female figure on the hill stagger and fall to the ground, and how the male figure, the shooter, stood over the woman and fired another shot into her. The defense tried to trip him up, questioning him over and over on what the suspect was wearing, but it didn't score any points because it wasn't as if John was claiming he didn't do it, just that he was insane at the time. Then Angie Lord testified. A stir of expectation rustled through the audience, wrote the LA Times, as a rather pretty girl came into the courtroom and quietly took her place upon the stand. She said she'd known the couple for a little over a year. She talked about the note John sent to Mabel and everything that ensued that night. When Angie did live at the Holden house, she talked about the many times she heard John yell at Mabel, call her names, and tell her all sorts of cruel things other people were allegedly saying about her. She said that John kicked Mabel out in February for no apparent reason and took their daughter away going north. Mabel had no idea where he had gone or if he was even coming back. That was when she came to live with her parents. He did return a few days later, it sounds like, and Mabel filed for divorce. Lily Barnes, the neighbor, testified that she heard Mabel scream, "Oh, Mother, I'm shot, I'm shot." Deputy Sheriff Barnhill testified and confirmed Lily Barnes' story of confronting John Barthelman in the jail and him saying that if he had to do it over, he'd make a better job of it. It was very heartbreaking for people in the courtroom to watch Howard Holden, Mabel's grief-stricken father, take the stand and give his story. He choked back sobs when he described seeing his daughter lying in blood and carrying her up to the house. Through it all, John Barthelman sat unmoved. Howard told the court of the many times he had heard John curse at Mabel and even say to her that he wished her and their daughter dead, that it would be a good thing. Howard said John would one moment say he loved his wife and the next say he hated her. The defense was able to get Howard to admit John had a, quote, queer disposition during these conversations and that he really didn't like to talk to John because he found him unpredictable. The only time John showed emotions was when Howard described his former son-in-law holding Dorothea on his lap while having one of these queer conversations. John bowed his head and cried. Anna Holden, Mabel's mother, was described as feeble and grief-stricken. She said her daughter had never given any reason for the constant fighting or treatment she received from John, but when abused, she stood up for her rights. But that she sometimes, quote, forgot herself and replied in strong terms. I found it rather sad and aggravating that this was an acceptable notion, still is. Stand up for yourself when abused, but not too much. Stay in your place. Otherwise, you're cruising for a bruising. Mr. and Mrs. Venom testified, as did J.T. Sheward, Mabel's employer, who said that while the couple had been separated, John came to Sheward and tried to get him to fire Mabel so that she would be forced to return to him for support. When Sheward refused, John tried to, quote, blacken his wife's character, which only resulted in him being booted from the store. When the defense opened, they would be attempting something that really hadn't been broached before in the Los Angeles courts, at least, temporary insanity, or what we might hear today as a crime of passion, or crime committed in the heat of passion. Contributing to this was a family history of mental illness and a series of head injuries that John sustained. This was another reason people packed the courtroom for this trial. It was a kind of novel case, and the papers called it an ingenious defense. Frank F. Davis, his attorney, told the jury that he would show that John, quote, was driven crazy by trouble, and he brooded over his wrongs until his mind gave way in a frenzy and he committed the deed. It all began with depositions of John's family members who lived in Rochester, New York. Minute descriptions of the Barthelman, quote, family freaks played out like a Shakespearean comedy that packed the courtroom day after day and kept the audience in stitches. Simon Barthelman, John's cousin, stated in his deposition that John was flighty. John lived with him for about 2 weeks, and in that time, Simon observed evidence of what he called John's unsound mind and abnormal nature. This included suddenly changing topics in a conversation. Another time, John was wandering the house with a lantern looking for burglars, and that the next morning, when asked about this, he denied doing it. When John up and left Rochester, he later sent a letter to Simon from Cincinnati asking him to send him his trunk. It was sent, then sent back. And John wrote again asking for just certain contents. The next letter came from San Diego, where John requested his effects to be sent there, which they were, and they were received, but John later said he never got them. To Simon, this was behavior indicating insanity. He also said he knew John's father, grandfather, and sister Mary were of unsound mind. Mary, in particular, had an excitable nature and was cranky. Mary's insanity, according to John's brother Valentine in his deposition, was based on the fact that she shook her fist at a judge, informing him that, quote, she was not afraid of him or any other man. Clearly a deranged woman. Valentine described how their father suffered from insanity. That despite John being his favorite son, their father took John out when he was 9 years old and tied his limbs to a tree, just to hang there until someone released him. The father also used an axe to chop up a trunk belonging to one of John's sisters, then chased her with it. And he was also accused of trying to kill his second wife. But apparently, one of the more entertaining incidents was that the father tore up a feather bed and delighted in tossing up the feathers, saying it was snowing. As for John, Valentine described a few tumbles that John had taken as a child, injuring his head. It began as an infant, when he fell from his sister's shoulder and landed headfirst into a bucket of water, hence giving him water on the brain. One deposition from another sister, a Mrs. Hoffman, was not read because she said there was no truth to the tree story or the chopping of the trunk. Now, Mary's deposition stated that the whole family was cranky and eccentric, and all of them belonged in an asylum. Annie, another sister, said their father was of unsound mind, but there were no asylums in Germany to take him to, and that, quote, every family must take care of its own crazies. Like Hoffman, she said there wasn't any truth to the tree hanging story or the axe-wielding destruction, but she did say that John seemed to fall from chairs and tables every day and had a painful encounter with a snowball thrown at his head when he was 9. And finally, a former employer in New York said a fall from a wagon seemed to have changed John's demeanor of sunny sweetness to morose, sour, and cranky. After the depositions were read, the defense brought in local witnesses, hoping not only to establish John's unsound mind, but that Mabel provoked him. A friend, Fred Lichtenberger, testified that John was convinced Mabel was unfaithful to him, causing this deep sense of injury. This also marked the beginning of a new theme of the trial, tears and talk, or one might call the crying chronicles. The cigar stand owner, William Baskerville, who had known John for several years, said that on the day Mabel left, or as Angie Lord said, was kicked out, John had taken the baby for a ride, and when he came back, Mabel had moved out, taking much of the furniture and household items with her. From then on, it was all John talked and cried about. He'd get excited and cry and was pretty blue, Basquel said. If he had seen her and she had happened to give him a kind word, he seemed happy. John would come to the cigar stand and say, "I saw Mabel yesterday and I think she cares for me still. I believe if it was not for the people she is with, that she would come back to me." John also accused Mabel of being frivolous, unworthy, and unfit to care for their child. But he would cry so often, Basquel eventually said, on the Friday before the murder, "You had better stop that, or you'll drive yourself crazy." That's when John said, "I'll have to get out of here," and told Basquel he'd go to Sacramento, that he could do nothing in Los Angeles. Basquel, in his opinion, was that John was irresponsible for his actions, yet thought everything he said was reasonable. The prosecution, however, asked, "On the Friday before the shooting, you told the defendant that he would go crazy if he did not quit worrying. He was not crazy then?" "Well, he seemed half crazy to me then," he said. "What if," asked the prosecution, "Barthelman had taken out a gun and shot you that day? Would you still consider the man not responsible?" This seemed to trip Basquel up, and after a long pause, reluctantly said he wouldn't have considered him responsible. Mary Weeks, John's landlady on Downey Avenue, where he had been rooming for the previous 7 months, had been kept well aware of his troubles, which she admitted was partly because she took an unusual interest in him. He seemed to have that effect on women. In fact, extra chairs were brought into the courtroom to accommodate the, quote, curious femininity who were out in force to get a glimpse of the remarkably tender-hearted defendant who shot his wife 4 times. John told his landlady that Mabel left him, taking nearly everything with her, but also said, "I have not always done right myself, but few of us do." He would talk to Mary for hours, his eyes red and sunken from endless crying. He'd complain of sleeplessness and headaches, his pillowcase soaked with tears, and that these spells usually started after an interaction with Mabel. Mary didn't help matters, however, by relaying to him what gossip she had heard about Mabel, but said he deserved to know. So she had no problem in adding to the very thing that was allegedly provoking him into being unstable. When asked by the prosecution what other fact made her think he was crazy, she said that he would complain about how no one was buying sewing machines. "Is that a sure sign that he was crazy?" asked Prosecutor Davis. "Well, it led me to believe that he had not the faculty for selling things." She admitted, though, that she had rented John the room because she deemed him a responsible and reasonable person. The attorney asked her, "So if John came in with a gun and shot you or one of your boarders, you'd say he was not responsible?" "I don't think he would have shot anybody without provocation," she replied, and she believed Mabel provoked him. He asked her if she thought he would kill someone without provocation, and she said, "No, certainly not," which the prosecution took as John being perfectly sane. This got her flustered and angry, and she reiterated that John was provoked in the killing of his wife. A fellow boarder, a Mrs. P. Miller, said John spent a great deal of time brooding and crying. His favorite place to do so was the dining room sofa. The sure signs of his insanity was that he wouldn't eat his supper, complained of headaches, and cried incessantly. When the prosecution asked if he had broken her furniture or said her food wasn't fit to eat and refused to pay for it, would he be responsible? She said, "I would have thought he was crazy." Pearl Venom, the one who testified for the prosecution about John coming to her home after the shooting, took the stand for the defense. She said John often cried and complained of headaches, that he would say one thing, then immediately say the opposite. We never knew what he was going to say next, she said. On the night of the murder, John had told her that he was afraid he had done wrong in shooting his wife and that he'd had the harsh realization that his daughter just lost her mother and in all likelihood her father. Pearl believed his story and also believed him to be insane. She even admitted to helping to fund his defense. Adding to her belief of his insanity, she said that he had a habit of picking one of his thumbs with the fingers of his other hand, as though it itched all the time. John Venom, her husband, said he'd noticed a peculiar rolling of John's eyes. The reason I noticed, he explained, it was because he looked so much like a nephew of mine in East Los Angeles who has epileptic fits. While Mr. Venom said he thought Barthelman was unbalanced, on cross-examination he said he felt the defendant knew right from wrong. There were several other acquaintances and sewing machine customers who testified to John's outpouring of troubles, his copious tears, seen as definite signs of an unhinged mind. Feeling a bit waterlogged, the reporters took to their usual snark. One wrote, "All the water which Barthelman's had absorbed by his infant plunge into that bucket has evidently been oozing from his eyes during the last 7 months, and his prolonged lamentations over the cruelty of his wife poured into every ear that was even momentarily inclined toward him." Another wrote, "Anne Fowler was called, and a species of a rainbow brightened up her testimony, for it appeared that Barthelman sometimes indulged in a watery smile. He used to keep her sewing machine in order, and he wept over that luckless bit of mechanism enough to rust it. Barthelman went to see Fowler 3 times a week all summer, and as he always talked of his sorrows and always wept a gallon or less, it must have been slightly wearing at times." Other papers remarked that testimony regarding John's steady tap of tears and floodgates of woe had really run its course. This does, however, bring up an important point. Though society expected Mabel to behave in a certain way, standing up for herself too much was seen as something only men could get away with. Women who exhibited manly behavior like that were seen as aggressive and provoking. Even witnesses were asked about Mabel's reputation for truth and chastity, as if that had any bearing on the case. But on the other side of this was John's sadness, which was considered a sign of an unsound mind. Men don't cry, and if they do, there's something wrong with them. Whether John was faking it all those months for that purpose, or he was genuine, I don't know, but he, in his defense, ran with it. Now, Mrs. Fowler said that John confided in her that he was engaged to another woman, but only to take his mind off his troubles, and that Mabel broke up the match. Anne Fowler felt John was rational on all other subjects except for his wife, and that he became animated when talking about her, flailing his arms and would look cross-eyed, indicating to her, as she thought about it on the stand, that he probably was crazy. The consensus among reporters was that they saw through the defense's character assassination attempts on Mabel, and that those who testified for the defense weren't describing insanity, but rather an uncontrollable wrath. Uncontrollable wrath. I'll give my 2 cents on that later. John certainly wasn't exhibiting feelings of wrath during the trial, at least not visibly. Aside from his moment of sadness while Howard was testifying about Dorothea, John remained seemingly unaffected. The Los Angeles Evening Express wrote, "He is one of the quietest defendants who has ever sat in the criminal department of the Superior Court. He takes the same seat, assumes the same position in his chair, and is the same silent man that he was when the trial began early in the week. It was time for the defense to bring out Dr. H.G. Brainerd, an expert on brain diseases, and he concluded after examining John, hearing his family history, and the numerous head injuries that John's mind was imbalanced. Under severe strain, he might be irresponsible for his actions, even if he was conscious of those actions. He further said that John should be in an asylum. For their rebuttal, the prosecution brought in Dr. W.H. Fales, a graduate of Harvard Medical School, who the LA Times said testified in the famed 1893 Lizzie Borden case, the OG of true crime, which I thought was pretty cool until I couldn't verify that. His name never appeared in connection to that case. But in this case, he disagreed with Dr. Brainerd and said Barthelman was capable of knowing right from wrong. Further, California law at the time stated that if a person was sound enough to be conscious of an act, it couldn't be proven that it was committed by an insane person. Officer Robbins, who was in charge of John in the jail after his arrest, never questioned John's sanity, nor did several other of his sewing machine customers with whom he discussed his marital woes. Although 2 of them said that John didn't mention his wife nor cry, but that he was engaged to another woman. A Mrs. Merrill said, "He told me he intended to take his child, marry the woman he was engaged to, and have her take care of the child. I told him I thought it would be wrong to take the child from its mother, and he replied that his intended could take as good a care of it as the mother." Clayton Holden and his wife also gave their opinion that their former brother-in-law was perfectly sane. John finally started to show some nervousness, rocking in his chair, facial twitchings, and constantly tapping his foot or hand. The LA Times wrote, "Now and again, the wife murderer will give an almost imperceptible start as some part of the oft-repeated story of the homicide is read or recounted, and his eyes search for some place to rest where he will not find a constant reminder of the fact that he is looked upon by fellow men as a monster." The prosecution brought up the note that John sent to Mabel at her job. They said that he had asked her for a response so that he could then destroy the note so it couldn't implicate him. The defense scoffed at this, saying John, under delusions regarding his child, delusions being an indication of insanity, wrote the note on the impulse of the moment, no premeditation. Judge Davis began the closing address for the state, presenting the evidence in a very straightforward, no-nonsense manner, whereas Frank F. Davis for the defense employed all elements of theatrics, the razzle-dazzle. "God knows we all set our faces against crime," he said, "but remembering this, justice does not stand here calling for vengeance. Justice ever stands with eyes blindfolded in order that she may not see what common prejudice presents. She stands not with sword uplifted high, with point stained with blood and calling for vengeance, but the point of her sword is ever downward. She stands not with the red cap of anarchy in her hand, calling for blood, but she stands with the even scale, saying, 'Let fact come in, let science, and with judgment, and let me be impartial.' That is justice." He said, "Better that 1,000 guilty men go free than one innocent man should be punished." A variation of English jurist William Blackstone's 1769 doctrine, "It is better that 10 guilty persons escape than that one innocent suffer." Davis continued, "You are not to be led away by the sympathy for the unfortunate family whose tears have creased with sorrow their faces and their hearts. They have my pity and yours, but you cannot destroy a man's life because you sympathize with them. He concluded by imploring the jurymen to invoke the mercy of Christianity, specifically the crucifixion of Christ and his forgiveness of those who persecuted him. Deputy District Attorney McComas often referred to Barthelman in his final address as the murderer, whose heart was filled with bitterness against his wife. It took the jury all but 30 to 40 minutes to return with a verdict. When John was brought in, he was described as deathly pale, and he, quote, drew his legs up under his chair and gripped the arms with a tight grasp, and that was all. He knew the worst. That probably, which he has anticipated from the time the law laid its icy grip upon him. Even after the guilty verdict was read, he kept his composure. He remained silent on his way back to his cell and just curled up on his bed and began to sob. His attorneys filed a motion for a new trial on several grounds, mainly the prosecution's reliance on non-expert witnesses who testified that Barthelman was, quote, perfectly sane and in his right mind, notwithstanding the fact that most of the defense's witnesses gave their non-expert testimony in regard to his alleged insanity. The defense also claimed the prosecution failed to prove malice or motive, in other words, intent, and that a motiveless crime is born out of irresponsibility, and the jury should have acquitted John. Judge Smith took the argument into consideration and a couple of days later, on February 10th, ruled against the defense about the non-expert testimony, and as to intent said, I cannot agree that the verdict was contrary to the evidence and that no motive was shown for the homicide. The relations between the defendant and his wife were such that, from the standpoint of motive, there could have been no friendly feeling. These unhappy marriages and resultant divorces around all the animosity existent in human nature. When a divorce is obtained, it is certain that the feelings of the parties are not friendly and may be very bitter. The question is one of intent, a preconceived, deliberate attempt, and may result from anger, avarice, and other of the passions that move men. If a man pulled a pistol and shot a stranger upon the street, would it be contended that it was not murder in the first degree? Such an act would show a base, malignant heart. He asked John if he had anything to say, and he did not. Judge Smith then said, John Barthelman, I want you to remember that it is the law that is speaking to you and passing your sentence, not I. You have broken a law which is punishable by death, and I trust that your sentence will be an example and warning to all who, in a heat of passion, might take that life that cannot be restored. He didn't flinch when sentenced to be hanged May 7th. The death warrant, rolled neatly and tied with large black satin ribbons by the clerk, was given to the sheriff. When John was taken to the jail office to get his description and measurements taken before leaving for Folsom that afternoon, the jailer instructed the clerk to note Barthelman's expression, which was evidently pleasant, and this amused John. He laughed and joked about the matter. He gave his age as 31, wrote the LA Times, and said with a faraway look in his eyes that it was just 1 year ago yesterday that his wife left him and troubles commenced. He told the papers that he had no complaints about his treatment by officers in the county jail, except when Officer Barnhill corroborated Lily Barnes when she said she came to the jail to identify John, and that he said if he had the job to do it over again, he'd do a better one than before. John denied saying that and remarked, quote, in an earnest tone that if a sacrifice of his life could restore that of his murdered wife, he would gladly make it. He claimed his mind was and had always been blank when it came to his actions that night. He further contended that if Judge Smith had known what he had been through the previous 2 years, he would have granted him a new trial, but he said he would take death like a man and not die by suicide. When he found out he was going to Folsom on the 2 o'clock train, though, his cheerfulness drained, and he asked to see his lawyer and his daughter. Both requests denied. "Oh well," he said, "I expect my baby has forgotten her papa by this time, as she is only 4 years old and has not seen me for 3 months. I may never see her big brown eyes again, eyes so like her poor mother's, for there is no money to send her to Folsom, nor anyone to take her there if I could pay her fare. Perhaps it is for the best, but oh, how I would like to kiss my baby goodbye." His final words to the reporter came out in a whisper when he repeated, "I would gladly give my life today. Could I, by doing so, bring Mabel back from the grave?" Barthelman was then whisked off to Folsom, where, said the LA Herald, "the death cells are tombs for the living. The walls and ceiling are of granite, and a heavy gun fired outside could scarcely be heard by a condemned prisoner within these tomb-like chambers. High up on the wall is a tiny, heavily barred window admitting a scanty light, and inside the walls are of a dazzling white. Abandon hope, all ye who enter here," might truly be inscribed over the doors of these chambers, and in one of them Barthelman will remain until the Supreme Court passes upon his case. On his way to Folsom, he allegedly spoke candidly with Sheriff Burr, who had taken many men to Folsom, including John Craig from episode 4, and said John told him he had been provoked by his wife's infidelity and that she had corrupted their daughter in many ways, including, get this, teaching her how to hula dance. The following month, March of 1897, Barthelman sent several letters to friends, including Frank Lichtenberger, where John accused his former in-laws of trying to, quote, wreck his daughter's life. And whether or not it was a play at trying to come off as unstable, I don't know, but it did read a little paranoid. He wrote, "They all know that my little queen, Dorothea, has a wonderful future before her, and they are trying their utmost to ruin her, the same as they did her mother. They succeeded in getting me locked up and am unable to protect my dear baby. Therefore, I must ask my friends to see that she is not led in the footsteps of her mother. The more I think about it, the more assured I am that they are bent upon her destruction. I feel certain that some people in high authority are connected with this scheme. I want you to see my attorney and put him on guard in order that he may be able to frustrate their designs. As I am writing this letter, I can hear my little queen calling to me for help. Fred, you must go to her rescue. Be sure and see my attorney before it is too late to save my little darling. Let me know you succeed in breaking up the conspiracy." His attorney, Frank Davis, said, "Several letters written by Barthelman have been shown me lately and are strongly confirmatory of the fact that the terrible disease with which he has long been afflicted is rapidly reaching its culmination, and his complete insanity is a condition to be momentarily anticipated. I should not be surprised at any time to receive information of his complete loss of mental control." But the next record in the case came in October, when Davis argued the appeal in front of the state Supreme Court, saying that Mabel, knowing her husband's mental weakness, did nothing to lessen the man's aggravation. In other words, she didn't stay in her place, and that's what led to her death. Her cruelty toward John angered him to desperation. Well, the classic victim blaming didn't work. In February 1898, the court denied his appeal, which was mostly based on jury instructions that the defense was denied to give, primarily ones about reasonable doubt and insanity. But the higher court found that this instruction was adequately given. The court further stated that the prosecution could have actually successfully objected to certain testimony regarding the defendant's insanity, but didn't, writing, "Indeed, the whole record shows that appellant's effort to sustain his defense of insanity was given wide range, and that there can be no just claim that it was unlawfully or unfairly restricted." The following month, Deputy H.C. McClure, who made the trip back to L.A. from Folsom with John, told the papers that the man appeared close to insanity. And McClure would know, he said, because he became quite acquainted with John during his incarceration in the jail. He said John talked incessantly about the case. At this time, John didn't know the court's decision. He told the deputy, "Mac, my life is lost to me, no matter which way the Supreme Court goes. My life is nothing to me now. I don't think I ought to hang, though. I don't think I was responsible when I killed her. I have only a confused memory of it now, but I believe I thought I was firing at some man I imagined had come between us." John was resentenced, and the Los Angeles Herald wrote, "Barthelman's appearance does not indicate that he has undergone any mental suffering during his long detention. He is fat and healthy. He wore good clothing, was clean-shaven, with the exception of a flowing mustache, and there was nothing about the cut of his hair to indicate his sojourn in a state prison. A few wrinkles in the corners of his eyes alone showed that time flies with prisoners as well as men who are free." The prison also allegedly declared that John had been a model prisoner, exemplary. After being sentenced to hang May 12th, he told a reporter he was resigned to his fate, and that from the time he last saw Mabel alive until he woke up in a cell, his mind was perfectly blank. "If I did kill her," he said, "I surely must have been crazy at the time, for I don't remember having done it." Very little was reported about his hanging, which wasn't that unusual when it came to wife killers. They weren't generally well liked, and also I think because they tended to generally claim their mind was blank, so no use in trying to get anything out of them. The only reports were that he was resigned to his fate, which was a common phrase attributed to many of the condemned, that he mounted the gallows at 10 a.m. and said nothing before falling through the trap. So from what I could find, Dorothea lived with her mother's brother, Clayton Holden, and his wife Ida, who were actually quite high society. He was a very successful, well-known carpenter like his father, and he had built and managed the Los Angeles Country Club. In 1910, at age 17, Dorothea, who now went by Dorothy Holden, was living with her aunt and uncle and her cousin Vera. Unfortunately, the only other record I could find of Dorothy, which drives me bananas, was in 1911, where she was vacationing with her aunt and uncle in San Francisco. And that was it. So earlier, I mentioned John's uncontrollable wrath. A crime of passion is one committed in the, quote, heat of passion, or in response to provocation, meaning it wasn't premeditated. Provocation can be seen as a mitigator to downgrade a murder charge to, say, manslaughter. I'm curious what you all think about it. I don't think it's black and white. There's a lot of gray area. But for argument's sake, if we take out factors like brainwashing, conditioning, coercion, established mental illness, and all of that, and bring it down to the basics, emotions. What's truly justifiable? And to what degree? We are, after all, the only ones in charge and in control of our feelings and emotions. And I'd argue that what we're provoked into doing is to make a choice. Choose your own emotional adventure. Yeah, I know that sounds simple, and things can happen fast. Reflex, impulse. which is typically why we think we have no choice, that we couldn't help it, that this other thing or person made us feel and thus react. But that's just blame, right? I don't think we lose control of our emotions. I think we give up control. To lose it implies we had it. We had control. No one takes it. It doesn't go missing. These aren't car keys. It's internal. And I think it's safe to say we choose to be happy, joyful, be at peace. Even forgiveness is a choice. We generally, proudly take responsibility for our positive emotions, yet blame others for our negative ones because they're less becoming, less attractive, and can be destructive. And we don't want that on us. In California, for the murder to be downgraded to manslaughter, no malice, there's a subjective element to it. The defendant had to be, quote, adequately provoked into the heat of passion, and the crime had to be in response to the provocation. Is there a time limit? When is it a justifiable reaction from the heat of passion and not simply retaliation, lashing out, which I'd say can certainly contain malice, even be driven by it. Just anger itself can be propelled by malice. And provocation isn't necessarily an excuse to abandon personal responsibility. Where is the line? We're not talking about self-defense. I know, as I said, it's not black and white, and most of you know I'm a very big proponent of incorporating much more grace and compassion into our criminal justice system, and that not all murders should be tried and treated the same way. There's way too much nuance involved. We need more grace, because I think we can all relate to some degree. We've all let loose our temper or allowed our ugly side to surface and probably regretted it. I suppose what I'm trying to say here is we might have less crimes of passion, heated moments that lead to murder and other crimes if we recognized on a daily basis in our lives in general that there is not a thing outside of us that controls our emotions, feelings, and actions. If we give up this idea that so-and-so made me angry, made me jealous, or made me frustrated, we'd see that really what they did was provoke us to make a choice. And negative emotions like anger is so much easier to choose. It's hard to choose the other side of that. You know, the high road can feel out of reach. But I think we can teach ourselves this. What are your thoughts on personal responsibility of emotions, feelings, and actions? And with John Barthelman, do you think it was a crime of passion, heat of the moment, or as they called it then, temporary insanity? Or was it premeditated? It was said at trial that John was known to carry a firearm. At least one witness who knew him years earlier said that. I'm not sure if he was in a habit of carrying a gun leading up to the murder, but he had one. And he had a convenient excuse to carry one, the election and being out late. Plus, a lot of people were out, so it could have been easier to escape. Police were preoccupied. But it seemed to me that John didn't have an exit plan. He told the cigar store owner he was going to Sacramento, but he didn't. He never even left Los Angeles and went back to the home of the person he told the night before that he did it. He had a history of being a jerk. So my thought is he was full of bitterness, rage, jealousy, and malice, and blamed others for it. Maybe he was a little off. I think he had to be to treat his wife the way he did and to ultimately kill her, but not enough to not know what he was doing. So, what do you think? I'd love to know. I'm very eager to share the next episode. It's going to be a good one. It's one of my favorites. Folsom's 11th execution. Frank Bellew had it out for his whole family. And how it all went down and how he was caught was really, truly fascinating. So I hope you'll join me for that, aiming for June 20th. And don't forget, in the meantime, you can enjoy some bonus episodes on the Patreon, and I'll be adding some more. So thank you for joining me for this episode of Falling Through the Trap. Falling Through the Trap is written and produced by me, April Moore. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also leave a review, and follow the show on Instagram at Falling Through the Trap. I'll post photos and other documents on my Substack page, apriljmoore.substack.com, where you'll also be able to listen to each episode. Find the show on YouTube as well. Check the show notes for links, including one for Patreon, where I share lots of extras. Join me every third Friday of the month, where you'll learn the story of the next man to fall through the trap at Folsom Prison.